Unfolding Consciousness, Exploring the Living Universe and Intelligent Powers in Nature and Humans is our subject, and our writer and speaker is Edi Bilimoria. Born in India and educated at the universities of London, Sussex and Oxford, Edi is an extraordinary blend of experience in the fields of science, art, and philosophy. A dedicated student of the Perennial philosophy for half a century, Edi has given courses and lectured extensively in the UK and internationally in California, the Netherlands, India, and Australia. He has organized and chaired several major conferences on the different but overlapping roles of science, religion, and practical philosophy. He has also served as education manager for the Theosophical Society in Australia, developing courses and supervising the research, national media, and national members' lending libraries. His written work has been published extensively all over the world in the fields of science, engineering, and esoteric philosophy. Edi is an award-winning consultant engineer for the petrochemical, oil and gas, aerospace, transport, and construction industries. He has also worked in safety and environmental management for the Royal Navy and has been project manager and head of design for major innovative projects such as the Channel Tunnel, the London Underground systems, and offshore installations. Edi is also an experienced glider pilot. He's a talented singer and an extraordinary pianist, and practices regularly on his mahogany Steinway grand piano. Edi Bilimoria is a lovely and gentle, compassionate soul with a powerful presence and the most beautiful of hearts. From the Orangery in the Fan Museum in Greenwich, London, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Edi Bilimoria.
Now, what I'd like to do is to present the purpose and the relevance of this work before going into a little bit of an overview detail so you can see what you're getting for it. Let us start not with a meditation, but with something to meditate upon. We are immensely grateful to science and technology. We are always grateful to science, but there seems to be a global monopoly of scientific materialism. So is there something missing? Let's ask the question, is there something missing? Let's hear from someone who knew a thing or two about such matters.
Our age is proud of the progress it has made in man's intellectual development. The search and striving for truth and knowledge is one of the highest of man's qualities. Though of the pride is most loudly voiced by those who strive the least. And thirdly, we should take care not to make the intellect our goal. It has, of course, powerful muscles, but no personality. It cannot lead, it can only serve. And it is not fastidious in its choice of a leader. This characteristic is reflected in the qualities of its priest, the intellectual. The intellect has a sharp eye for methods and tools, but is blind to ends and values. So it is no wonder that this fatal blindness is handed on from all to young and today involves a whole generation.
That is the real Einstein in 1943. This is the question I've posed, asking the question on the slipcase here. The answer surely is this, which is our response here, that despite our considerable benefit from scientific technology, we seem to have forgotten our spiritual origins, as shown to us by the perennial philosophy. Now, why has this come about? There seems to be this prevailing attitude, this worldview, that we are just machines. One of the intellectual priests, as Einstein would have put it, has said in the 2020 World Economic Forum, a man who has spoken to all the heads of state in Europe, and I quote, "We must now forget the idea that we have mysterious souls. We are only hackable animals, and that's what we are." A slight bit of fuzzy logic. We must now forget, but we once were mysterious souls. But we're not allowed to argue with the intellectual priests. I mean, the politics of knowledge is very strong. So we are just now a biological machine in need of an upgraded operating system, like a computer. And in fact, this gentleman, you know who he is, he has the real formula for the 21st century, and this is not just a euphemism. He means it. It's B times C times D. Biological knowledge times computing power times data equals hackable animal. So that's what's going out. But we can see how this reduction of a human being to a mechanism has impoverished our sense of humanity, and impoverished and degraded our sense of values. And that is one of my central purposes for producing this work, to restore humanity to human beings. So what's the answer? The key must be, man, know thyself. The age-old message we find at the Temple of Apollo in Delphi. Now, a route map through the 4 volumes, a very quick route map. The first volume is a panoramic survey contrasting science with the perennial philosophy on consciousness and man. The second volume takes a microscopic peering down into the inner landscape of the human being. The third volume, gazing through the telescope, situates man in the wider cosmos, man the measure of all things. And the fourth volume is the references. The highlights from each volume are the following: contrasting the scientific and the esoteric perennial philosophy, all the various subtle states of mankind, of man I should say, pertaining to mankind. And the third volume deals with the Hermetic axiom primarily, and from that basis unpacks the whole question of immortality from the standpoint of science and the perennial philosophy, before the final chapters on the primacy of consciousness. But why all this emphasis on the perennial philosophy? It's a term used by Aldous Huxley, of course, and similar terms are eternal wisdom, mystery teaching, esoteric doctrine. All these terms subtly nuance the fact of the eternal wisdom. Gupta Vidya puts the emphasis on divine wisdom, Theosophia, godly wisdom, the great Newton, sacred wisdom. Sacred. What is precious must be sacred. This is the great Leibniz, Philosophia Perennis, and the Swiss, Fritz of Schuon, the religious perennial philosophy. But why perennial? Albert Schweitzer likened perennialism to a tree that constantly brings forth new fruit, but never the same fruit. So the same eternal precepts have got to be modified and cast in the idiom of the age. But it is always the perennial tree that gives us these fruits. Now, why such significance? It's also, the perennial philosophy is an overarching term, and a more insightful word is the thread doctrine. What does a thread do? Think of your necklace. It passes through the thread doctrine and unites and strings together all the scientific religious systems and explains them on the basis of universal precepts, not beliefs. So we can think of the science, religion, and philosophy united with the reconciling thread, the thread doctrine, and the approach is, of course, holistic. But it does not in any way castigate the reductionist approach, not at all, but the approach is essentially holistic. Just a few technical terms before we move on. Again, the perennial philosophy is an overarching term. Its teachings disseminated through the great sages and saints are known as the mystery teachings. And the thread doctrine, or the esoteric doctrine, are these teachings. Now, what's the significance of esotericism? That's so important. Esoteric simply means hidden, to do with the inner, and therefore to do with the hidden, noumenal, and unseen causes behind the outward phenomena. Occult science, apart from all the nonsense with its associations with witchcraft and all, simply means to do with the inner. It is the sacred science that delves deeply into the causal realms of universal nature, physical, psychic, mental, and spiritual. So in a sense, it is the science of the subjective. But the mystery teachings, let me emphasize, are not a panacea for all the ills and evils of the world, not at all. The point is that the sages and saints could not have anticipated every problem of this or that generation. But by virtue of teaching life on the basis of eternal verities, there is a mental culture that is so inculcated that any individual can rise to the challenge that he is faced with at any time. Rather like, if you're an expert driver, you can't possibly anticipate all the potholes and all the traffic lights on the way to Devon, but as an expert driver, you know how to negotiate your way through. So that's why we refer to the perennial philosophy in a sense as a universal algebraic formula. And the culture of the mind is something that our leaders and politicians are sadly neglecting now, faced with the human, medical and humanitarian crisis that our world is facing. And I do feel that today is Ascension Day. There is no more propitious moment to remind the world of what it means to be human in these turbulent times. So now let's look at Volume 1, and I'll just show you the various chapters Schrödinger pointed out that we know how air waves on the eardrum and a neurochemical process to the brain, we know that mechanism, but how is it that, for example, a Chopin nocturne can reduce one to tears? And for that, he says, we do not belong to this material world, and science pretends to answer these questions and gets a bit silly about it. So, Volume 1 in 2 sections, justifying the triumphs of science, but also equally justifying the need for a higher philosophy, core precepts and insights into the nature of the human being at all levels. So the first major section, and here are just the chapters, bearing in mind always what Max Planck said, that if you leave the human being out of your inquiry, you'll never get to any sort of truth, because you are part of it. And I find it very sad that these great scientists, Max Planck, Schrödinger, Einstein, Newton, they all said the same thing. And who listens to them? And I think it's, as Schrödinger pointed out, there was such an explosion of science in the 19th century that material development, fine, through technology, morphed into materialism. So that's been a major reason. Section 1, we contemplate our inner being, and we look at the mind-brain problem and explore the paradigm of science and see its limitations. And then we look beyond science to a new continent of thought, which involves Gothian science and the yoga of the mind. A science of qualities, not just quantities. We're not ignoring quantities, but we are saying we need qualities. And a general chapter on the mystery teachings, what occult science affirms, and the mystery teachings about man, who or what am I, and then a recapitulation. So I will just now go over a few highlights in Volume 1. The chapter on the paradigm of science is a very complex one, so such complex chapters I always start with a summary of the major sections in the chapter, what the subject matter is, and the intended purpose, before delving into the nitty-gritty of the material. Bearing in mind that this is the overall message of Volume 1. Chapter 6, a new kind of thought, is the transition to the mystery teachings. It's a new way of looking at things, and here I draw extensively on William James, who said even in the 19th century, the prevailing idea was thought as a function, a productive function of the brain. But what kind of production? We have three kinds of production. Steam is produced by a kettle. The crossbow releases the arrow, it does not produce the arrow. But the most important, which we really neglect, is the third, the transmissive. And here the great psychologist quotes from the great poet Shelley that life, like a dome of coloured glass, stains the white radiance of eternity. What a beautiful saying. And here the poet has insight far beyond his times. Let me illustrate this beautiful saying using the simple analogy between life and light. A prism splits white light into the spectrum of colours, and our brains do exactly that. All our conditioning, all our baggage, all our bits and pieces and prejudices and rubbish we accumulate splits and stains the white light of truth into all of these various psychological states. Now, I mentioned the perennial philosophy, the outpouring. What a lovely saying by William Blake. The tree that moves some to tears of joy is merely an obstacle that stands in the way to others. As a man is, so he sees. So the perennial tree has produced all of these various traditions through the ages, disseminated through all the great schools that you can see here, prehistoric and historic. Now, chapter 9 is my favorite, if I could pick on a favorite, because the whole purpose is to explain the unfolding of man's inner nature. And there we deal with the mysteries of antiquity. The American mysteries are not much talked about. They're very important and very significant. The contemporary mystery teachings through the Theosophical movement, and most importantly also related 19th century spiritual teachings, Emerson, Ralph Waldo Trine, Thomas Troud. Thomas Troud's an interesting one. He constantly emphasized that for him one of the worst sins is to tell a lie. Need I say any more? Right. William James was highly appreciative of Troud's science of mental science lectures at the Edinburgh University. But why are we doing this? Why? Because the consummate achievement of the mysteries is to unite man with himself. And so this is true alchemy, that only by raising the lower nature to the highest grade of perfection and purity, and it is this knowledge of how man's composite nature can be most speedily unfolded is the real purpose of the esoteric doctrine and the spiritual schools of all ages. Let's just look at one kind of spiritual school, the wonderful Elephanta caves just off the coast of Bombay. Another one, the Ellora caves. And I find it very moving to know that the great Pythagoras, after his journeying through ancient Iran and Hindustan, was a pupil of the Brahmins at Ellora and Elephanta. And indeed, Pythagoras' name is referred to in the Brahmin records as Yavanacharya, the Ionian teacher. And after returning from India, he established his great university at Crotona, where he taught the secrets of mathematics, geometry, and astronomy. So we sincerely applaud the triumph of science, and this is one of Bernard's famous diagrams, which I'm very fond of. Science has discovered literally everything from the largest dimension, relativity theory, right to the smallest dimension, quantum theory. But what is missing is mind. It is, I'm sure Bernard would agree with me, it is a triumph of mindlessness, which does not mean physicists are mindless. It means that mind has yet to enter their considerations. So this then provides the springboard to Volume 2. I spoke a little earlier, before we do that, on the Greek and ancient mysteries. And I'd just like to tell you about the Greek rites. The Greek rites talk about the god Bacchus, who was torn to pieces by the giant Titans, who then scattered his body far and wide. Jupiter, the father of Bacchus, beholding the crime, hurled his thunderbolt at the Titans and reduced their body to ashes. And from the ashes, the human race was created. However, the ashes also contained a portion of the Bacchic body, which the giants had partially devoured. So, the human being is a composite creature, displaying the Bacchic state, the godly state of the rational soul in the state of self-knowledge, and the Titanic state, the rational soul scattered, and so losing its consciousness of its own self. And we all know when our thoughts are scattered, how our judgment is impaired. So, a route map through Volume 2, talking of the inner geography of the human being. It's in 3 sections. Occult science on man's composition, his subtle bodies, and really demolishing this idea that man is a machine and the brain is just a computer. And then the perennial philosophy and its unity and the common origin of all worldwide philosophies. Keep in mind this beautiful saying of Robert Browning, again, the poet has led the way. We start with an inquiry, who we are, and then using the sort of medical analogy of anatomy and physiology, we talk about the occult anatomy and the occult physiology. Obviously, occult meaning what MRI scans and X-rays are not going to reveal. But we need to look at man in terms of structure and function, how he is made and how he behaves. He can only behave as he is made. And as he is made, so he behaves, so he energizes. Death is transition is most important. Section 2 on mind and brain, clarifying some usual confusions between soul and spirit. But is the brain a wet computer? Are we lumbering robots? I've gone into all the arguments that they put forward to support it, and then explain why it really doesn't stack up, other than through their own prejudice. And section 3, the unity of the perennial philosophy on man's eternal landscapes. Here we've summarized the essential teachings from all of these great systems, East and West, ancient and modern, and the coda is an interesting one that summarizes the whole volume on how to construct and energize a human being. So if I go through some highlights of this volume, we all have experienced the state where we do things that we regret. Why on earth did I say that? Why did I do that? What made me do that? I'm seeing some smiles here. Plato taught that the soul, in a general sense, psyche, can either, it has two choices. It can either rise and identify itself with Nous, the god Bacchus, and that way it is the spiritual soul, the immortal soul. Alternatively, it can descend and attach itself to the Titanic state, which he calls Anoia. Anoia is folly, the irrational soul. In the tarot cards, that's rather beautifully shown by the youth in the center who has two maidens loving him. And I promise you, your virtues and your vices love you equally. They really do, but you have to choose. So your virtues and your vices both love you, but you must choose. So, we are one divine entity expressing through a material principle. So, we can look at the human territory in many ways. We are a unified being. We can look at ourselves in terms of the mortal self and the immortal self, and we can further stratify that in terms of spirit, soul, and body. The most complete division is the septenary, the occult division. And it is occult, why? Because all of this cannot be exposed through MRI and X-rays. There's a different way of understanding them. So again, you see that the mind principle has a choice of ascending or descending. So the divided mind can either align with Nous, the rational soul, or the giant titans, the irrational soul. So it is our choice whether to ascend to the stars or behave like the Minotaur. And of course some of you, I'm sure all of you, are thinking of the McGilchrist's wonderful work, The Divided Mind. It is, I can tell you, literally all the esoteric philosophies of any nation, any age, will talk about this double function of the mind principle. It's not double manufacture, it's one mind. But it's the operation, it's the how, not the what it does, which is so important to take on board. And here is the ego that creates all the problems. And the ego is not to be despised. It is our emissary. It can either turn against us, but without an ego, you can't do anything in the world. We need tools and techniques. Right? Now, I put it to you that besides Kyle Garan, if Pythagoras, Francis Bacon, Hamlet, Yogananda, John Keats and Isaac Newton all affirmed that death is not the ending of everything, I suggest we take their injunctions rather seriously. And there is therefore a substantial chapter dealing with the whole process, obviously life on Earth, 2 levels of post-mortem existence, 2 levels before the next terrestrial incarnation, bearing in mind always that we're not talking of the incarnation of the corruptible, we're talking of the higher self taking on new vestures in the same way as you change your clothing, but you haven't changed. Well, not much anyway. So this whole process is described in some considerable detail. And here is a description of Purgatoria. Italian, Kamaloka, Sanskrit, Hades, Greek. If all these cultures and languages refer to the same phenomena, you know, they haven't been emailing each other. This is part of the heritage of humanity. And this is Botticelli's diagram. from Dante's Divine Comedy. The chapter on harmony with world teachings and religions deals with the Theosophical tradition, the Eastern tradition, and the Western tradition. And just a little taster of the complexity of that. Don't try and read the detail, but the Egyptian, Indian, and Zoroastrian, they can all be slotted in terms of the taxonomy of the basic dual constitution, triple, and the septenary. So however you carve up the cake, so to speak, one can see how the jigsaw puzzles all interlock and interface. And the whole point of this arrow is to show that this is the stake in the ground. There's no point in putting all of this up without relating it to a central teaching. The Greek tradition, again, relating it to the central teaching, the Greeks, Plato, Pythagoras, Anaxagoras, Plutarch, all of them can be, without forcing it at all, logically fitted into this taxonomy. So volume 2 closes with a nice little thing on the harmony of philosophers. You remember Newton's famous diagram where he split light into its colours with a prism, then inverted the prism and got white light. So that gives me the idea from Leibniz is saying that we need a harmony of philosophers. So instead of prisms, we have lenses. So imagine the white light of truth through these various teachings, expressed and diffused through many teachings, which give their own different colouring. But our job is to be like a converging lens, to bring them all together by a framework acting as a reconciling system of harmony. So, as above, so below. The great teachings need us to work with them. Otherwise, they're just unearthed, they're untethered. So, how are we made? Well, if you want to construct a temple or your house, you need a foundation, you need an apex, and you need some internal stories. So we are made in the same way. The apex is our divine self, the foundation is a physical body. And we have 3 souls. Remember Browning, 3 souls that make up 1 soul. We are made like this. How are we energized? Think of a power station. How do we function? We have a power station, and through transformers, the high voltage is stepped down to domestic houses. So, we have the divine self as the powerhouse, and the 3 souls that progressively step down, so to speak, the voltage of Atma to the physical level at a level that we can handle. If the whole of Atma expressed through our bodies, we'd soon blow up, I'm sure. So the various soul levels act as transformers. The human soul, the animal soul, and of course the spiritual soul. Let us remind ourselves here of the contrast between the exoteric approach and the esoteric approach in regard to life. The latest definition from NASA, with all their frenetic search for is there life on another planet? Oh gosh. Well, of course there is, not according to their definitions, because everything in the universe is conscious, and because we do not see anything, we have no right to say, therefore, that consciousness does not exist. I quoted Blake earlier, as a man is, so he sees. So there's no such thing as dead or blind law. And also, for the esotericist, the noumenal and the causative influences are far more important than the objective and phenomenal and transitory effects. So, a route map through volume 3, gazing through the telescope, where the entire wisdom and intelligence in the cosmos have gone not only into the whole human being, but even also into the human body. Into the human body. So symbolism is so important that unites cosmos, nature and man in terms of a different language. The Hermetic axiom is one of the most crucial laws, if I can put it, as above, so below. So we can understand what happens in the heavens by looking at what happens on earth, and also the other way around. And then evolution is another extended chapter. Symbolism is a key to wisdom. Then symbolic representations of the unity of cosmos, nature and man, and then the human body in symbolism, and symbolic representations from sacred literature of the West and East. The Hermetic axiom deals with correspondence and correlations at all levels between planets, between colors, between sounds, between the elements, between metals. All of these have their correlations. Cosmogenesis, a big word, is the unfolding of cosmos. Anthropogenesis is the unfolding of the human being. Chapters 8 and 9 are just about the most difficult for me, because one has to gather together the diverse strands from various teachings and create a coherent whole. So I've shown how the Samkhya philosophy of India, corroborated perfectly by aphorisms from the Bible, can be show the process or the emanation of the human being from divine consciousness. The awakening of latent faculties and powers of consciousness are to do with the three divine primary forces in the human being. Section 3 deals with our limitless and literally limitless evolution. And I think you will like this mathematical codicil. You might ask me later why I choose the word codicil, but there's a fair bit of mathematics in there. So a few highlights now through volume 3. On symbolism, the Druids have a very interesting symbol of the silent pool, which is fed by 4 underground streams that then feed out through 5 overground streams. And the underground streams are the narrative of the legend, the universality of the tradition, understanding man's transpersonal nature, personal gnosis, and with that rich nourishment we can enjoy the 5 outward senses. There's no teaching that you deny the enjoyment of the senses, but if the senses are not fed by these underground streams, then they can play havoc, as we see all around. No examples need be mentioned. One of my favorite sayings of the great Schiller, whom Beethoven immortalized, of course, with his Ode to Joy, was, "The universe is a thought of the deity, and because that divine thought has overflowed into actuality, all thinking beings should try and rediscover the divine intent." One can say this to oneself every day. So, how does one create the world by virtue of that overflowing? Well, you've got to be at rest first, then you've got to wake up, and then you've got to act. So, in the great Kabbalistic tradition is Ein, deity in repose, Ein Sof, deity emanating, Ein Sof Ur, the boundless light of the emanating deity. So in the Kabbalah, we have the macrocosm, the outflowing of divine thought in the macrocosm, and here you have the various levels, the spiritual, the archetypal, the intellectual, the substantial, and the physical, and mirrored the microcosm, the human body, the human self, the human soul, the divine self. And the wonderful, incredible Kabbalah knits this all together on the tree of life. And all of these spheres are called yods, and yod means a sphere of divine influence at that level. But all I want you to take on board now is that this has resulted from that. You have come as a result of that. The lotus is a beautiful ancient symbol. The lotus petals fall off and wither our mortal self. They don't sprout new seeds, but the seed pod will grow a new seed. So you have the perennial philosophy of the perennialism, that the tree will grow new fruit, never the same fruit, but the same kind of fruit. There's a lot of talk of consciousness now, and it's all brain, brain, brain. We forget that the heart and the generative system are primary centers of consciousness, but function in different ways. The heart, the source of life, the generative system, the source by which physical organisms are produced. But this brain thing that people go on about is the link, the important word is link, by which, through rational intelligence, life and form are united. So the human body is really a divine musical instrument, and the Indian instrument called the veena mirrors the human spine in terms of the spinal cord strings and the size of the vertebrae. And the veena is the favorite instrument of the goddess Sarasvati. And here you see her playing the veena, but you can't hear it, I'm afraid, because divine music is soundless. Neurocardiology is a substantial chapter, and here I'm reminded of Ollie Robinson's book, Paths Between Head and Heart. It is so important to engage the heart, not just in a touchy-feely way, of course we can do that, but there is no end of clinical evidence to show the link between heart and head. Now, this brain-mind conundrum, a substantial chapter, there are three quotes that really sum up the problem. Sir Francis Walsh was a great neurologist, and when a neurologist says this, we believe him. There is the confusion between the active principle and the passive instrument. Peter Leggett, one of our founding SMN members, said by analogy with the pianist and the piano, if either be deficient, so will be the music. But if we say that the pianist is the piano, or the violin is the violinist, then we must conclude that if the blood, bone and flesh of the human brain secrete thought, then the wooden string of the violin secrete music, never mind the violinist. And there's a beautiful story of the great violinist Joshua Heifetz when he arrived in Tel Aviv, and the taxi driver said, "Mr. Heifetz, your violin produces such lovely sounds." And he said, "Really?" He took it out of his case and tapped it. "Does it? What about me?" This mechanistic reductionist dwarfed one-directional thinking, where people cannot get away from machine paradigms. No one denies the Stradivarius, the Steinway, but it needs the pianist, who needs the composer, but the composer needs the divine. I've summarized, insofar as one can, the fundamental propositions of the perennial philosophy in terms of occult science, enlightened science, esotericism, and the Hermetic axiom. Now, Volume 4 really has definitions, editorial notes, a substantial glossary, further reading. But I've called this Profiles because I've shown the sequence of thought rather than just a bibliography which anyone or biography that anyone can find. I've shown their relevance to the whole perennial philosophy tradition, and you can see the great Blavatsky with a fan in the Fan Museum. So to help the reader, there are these navigational aids, and there are all of these literary aids, including a 104-page index, which Taps helped me with. Thank you for that. So even though it's complex work, of course, I've tried to make it as easy to navigate and find your way through as easy as possible. So let's now close with an example of unfolding consciousness. I quickly flashed up this. Few people have seen the mathematical papers of Isaac Newton that were put together in 1936, and this is apart from all of this. This is his complete output. Millions of words, literally millions, on his favorite subject, which was that and that all together. So the fact is, the man barely slept, literally. Lord Keynes said sometimes 2 or 3 hours a night. The point I'm making out is that unfolding consciousness is all very well, but you've got to do your bit. It doesn't unfold on your lap. It would be a bit boring if it did. My next example is a young man, the age of 35, who landed up in a pauper's grave. Mozart's output in the last 11 months. These were all his personal circumstances, and in 11 months he produced all of that. The red is the major works, the blue is the less major. And if you ever say, I've got a headache, I don't want to do this, well, just think of this. All of this was produced when he suffered from all of that. So we must suggest that if Albert Einstein referred to Newton as happy childhood of nature, Albert Einstein's cousin, Alfred Einstein, referred to Mozart as a prodigy of nature. But again, it didn't fall into his lap. You have to do the work. But the principle being illustrated is this: that our souls are literally immortal. And the only limits we put on ourselves are the limits we put on ourselves. Because our growth and our splendor has no limits, but we are ultimately our own lawgiver. We can either dispense glory to ourselves or doom. Thank you for joining me on the journey.